you for joining us for Thomson Reuters Talks Financial Crime. I am your host, Gina Jurva, attorney and manager of market insights and thought leadership for the Thomson Reuters Institute. Well, today we are back for the second part in a look at the new anti-money laundering law that was passed January 1st of 2021. In the previous episode, I spoke with Brett Wolf, a Thomson Reuters senior regulatory intelligence expert, and we talked about what those key changes to the anti-money laundering framework are as a result of the new law. So joining me today to discuss a significant facet of that law is Jim Richards. Jim is the principal and founder of RegTech Consulting, LLC. Jim, it is always a pleasure to talk with you, my friend.
Thanks for having me, Gina. Nice to see you again.
So Jim, just starting out, I teed it up a little bit, but tell us, why is this law so important?
Well, the U.S. has really struggled with corporate transparency and beneficial ownership. Now, back in the day, back with the Patriot Act, that actually required banks to collect beneficial ownership information on privately owned correspondent bank customers and private banking customers. But the U.S. has really run into trouble with the Financial Action Task Force. So the FATF, as it's known, is essentially a global body that sets the standards for anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism for about 200 countries that have sort of bought into the FATF concept. And the FATF has what they call their 40 recommendations, and 2 of them require countries to have transparency and beneficial ownership of legal entities and legal arrangements, as it's called. FATF also does examinations or evaluations of its member countries. Now, the U.S., the last 2 times the U.S. has been examined or evaluated by the FATF, they've actually been found to be non-compliant with these recommendations around transparency and beneficial ownership of legal entities. And what those requirements or those recommendations require is that the U.S. has a means to identify the beneficial owners of legal entities, and that it maintain a central registry that you talked about, Gina, of beneficial ownership information. And so what's happened is, when the U.S. was found to be non-compliant in 2006, they started to take steps to sort of come into compliance with the FATF recommendations. So we're all familiar now with the beneficial ownership rule that came into place in 2016, and which banks had to be implement by May of 2018. So that sort of addressed the can you collect and verify beneficial ownership information, but that was put on the onus of the banks. So what's happened here with the Corporate Transparency Act is the U.S. has tried to address the second prong of those non-compliant recommendations, and that is to have a central registry or database of beneficial ownership information. So it's been a long time coming, but we're trying to get into compliance with the global standards around corporate transparency.
And just to clarify, who this law is really aimed at. I mean, I think we're looking at what are considered shell companies. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that's the headline, and you mentioned that in your opening. It's all about ending anonymous shell companies. I mean, that's what we've been reading about. But actually, those headlines, Gina, are kind of wrong for a couple of reasons. And this is my opinion. I don't think shell companies are a problem, because a shell company is a company that has been legally created, but it's frankly not used in any fashion. It's simply a legal entity that is sitting there metaphorically on the shelf of some corporate formation agent in, say, Wyoming. It exists as a Wyoming corporation, but it isn't doing anything. And a shell company that sits on the shelf long enough becomes a shelf company. It's actually front companies we're worried about. So those are companies that are actually doing something. Now, they might be a bit of a shell. They're just being used to sort of pass transactions through, or they might be used as a real business. It's acting as a front. An example of that might be a pizza parlor that's acting as a front for a drug distribution company. Another example might be Madoff Securities, which was a front company for Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme. So we're not really ending shell companies. Maybe shell companies aren't a real problem. It's probably the front companies that are the real problem.
It's an important distinction. Another piece of it, of the new law, though, I mean, and when we're kind of looking at the way it's worded, it requires certain reporting companies to disclose beneficial ownership information to FinCEN. Now, there has been some criticism of what is actually considered a reporting company and what is not. So who is required to report this information, financial institutions or otherwise? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I talked about the beneficial ownership rule, which came into place in 2016 and banks had to implement by 2018. So for the last 2 or 3 years, that has required banks to collect and verify information on certain types of entities. And those entities, those legal entity customers, there's 16 different types that don't have to provide beneficial ownership. So it's all companies, LLCs, et cetera, but there's exemptions for 16 different types. Under this Corporate Transparency Act, there's now 24 types of entities that are excluded from this definition of reporting company that have to provide the identity of the beneficial owners, which is 1 to 5 people, plus the person who created or registered the reporting company. So what's the difference? What's the difference between the 16 or 18 from the current regime to the 24? Well, I think there's 3 big differences. Exempted from the definition of reporting company in this Corporate Transparency Act are money transmitters, which includes cryptocurrency exchanges, companies with 20 or more employees with 5 million or more in revenue that have a physical office in the US, and those shelf companies I mentioned, they may be excluded as well, but that's way beyond anything we can talk about today. Now, with respect to money transmitters, the thinking of Congress was that because money transmitters have to already register with FinCEN, and that registration including the ownership information, that they've already got it, so they don't have to include it here. But the problem with that is those money transmitters don't have to provide all of the beneficial owners to FinCEN when they register as a money transmitter. Only one person, the person who owns or controls the company. Secondly, that information isn't verified, and it certainly isn't maintained, and it's not in a database that is going to be connected to the FinCEN beneficial ownership registry, as far as we're aware. And then the third problem, and this is really a big one with sort of this exemption for a money transmission business, is the bad guys and their lawyers will figure out ways to plunk a money transmission business somewhere in that corporate chain, which blocks the ultimate beneficial owner. So I think Congress needs to take another look at that. And then I mentioned that large company exception, which is, again, companies with 20 or more employees, $5 million or more in revenue, and a physical location in the US. His intent was that large active companies can't be shell companies. And they're right, but they can be front companies. And front companies are more dangerous than shell companies. Think of Madoff Securities.
Sure.
And frankly, there's only about 50,000 or maybe even fewer of these companies in the entire country. I wouldn't exclude them. I'd make them provide their beneficial ownership information.
In addition to those that you've mentioned, are there any other entities that are missing from this list that you think should be included?
Well, yeah, actually. So the PPP program, or the Paycheck Protection Program that the Small Business Administration is running, there were 5.2 million entities that got PPP loans. And those included partnerships, sole proprietorships, unincorporated associations, which are all exempt from this reporting company definition. So I kind of think that if you have to register your beneficial ownership information with the SBA in order to get a PPP loan, you should probably have to register it with FinCEN as well.
Such a good point there. That's very true. Lastly, according to the law, FinCEN is going to be required to keep a non-public repository of beneficial ownership information. So anytime there's a treasure trove of information, either behind, government security or not, it seems to raise cybersecurity concerns. But what do you think of that? I mean, we saw what happened with the FinCEN leaks. So any final thoughts on the cybersecurity issues that may be raised here?
Yeah, actually, the Act covers that off pretty well. FinCEN is going to have to comply with very strict information security requirements, including encryption, because under the law, the registry is going to is what is known in federal law as a high impact system. And that's a system that holds sensitive information, the loss of which could cause individuals, the government, or the nation catastrophic harm, which sounds pretty terrible. And it's the highest standard that they apply to federal systems, and only about 9% of all federal government agency systems are this high impact system. Now, one could easily argue that the registry is moderate or even low risk system, and it's not going to cause catastrophic harm if the system's breached. But having it as a high impact system, I think, is going to keep a lot of the noise down and make sure that this, private information is held securely.
And is this, from those that you've talked to in the industry, and your own opinion, is this central repository, is this a welcome update to the AML laws, or what are you hearing?
Yeah, no, it is. Not just my opinion, but I think everybody realizes this is a really good thing to do. But it's a first step.
Sure.
That global standard, that FATF standard I talked about, it talks about a central registry of verified beneficial ownership information that is open to the public. So we're not quite there yet in the United States. I mean, the United Kingdom has that, and about 25 other countries have that, and dozens of other countries are moving towards it. And we're not even close. Our information isn't verified. It's not currently verifiable, and the registry is not going to be open to the public. But that said, I think it's a great first start. And it really does, I think it's going to make a big difference for AML and countering the financing of terrorism efforts in the US. So kudos to the US government for getting it done.
Well, more to come definitely in the coming months, and very excited to see how this plays out.
Yeah.
So Jim, thank you so much for joining us. Jim Richards, principal and founder of RegTech Consulting. Thank you so much once again.
Thanks, Gina. Thanks for having me, and stay safe.